Hey, thanks a lot, Dave. I guess just one correction to my bio. I just head the East Coast operations of our infrastructure practice group. I don't want my boss being upset thinking that there was a coup this morning. But first of all, thank you, Dave. And actually just want to start off by applauding ACEC for having a general session on public-private partnerships during this convention, because I really do think it's a timely topic. I'm not just saying that strictly for self-promotion purposes, but as Administrator Hendrickson had mentioned, earlier this year, everyone knows that the Trump administration launched a fairly ambitious infrastructure proposal aimed at generating, I think it's $1.5 trillion of investment in the United States. Now, while the White House's proposal does support about $200 billion in new federal spending over 10 years to accomplish this goal, I'm no math major, but obviously other means and methods needs to be relied upon in order to fill that investment gap, I would characterize it. And one of the tools in the toolbox that has been discussed in the industry is the use of public-private partnerships. And I know that each one of our panel members here have considered or are currently considering the use of public-private partnerships to deliver either an infrastructure project or their infrastructure program as a whole. And so I just want to start off by just asking the general question to each of you. What are the factors that drove or driving your desire to use public-private partnerships? And Russell, because you're closest to me, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Well, thanks, Simon. And first, I'd like to say thanks to ACEC for the great work you do. Certainly like to highlight the partnership we have with ACEC Georgia, Michael Sullivan and his team. We're all in this together. When we have to deliver transportation infrastructure, it is very much a we proposition to deliver. So we have a strong relationship there, and I'm just proud to be a part of ACEC in Georgia. But as it relates to P3, what's those considerations that you have to give in making those determinations? And in Georgia's case, it's a little bit probably different than what most people think. Usually people think about P3 is because you don't have enough money, you need more resources, and quite honestly, the political view is it's free money. And we all know there's no free lunch out there, right? But in our case, we had a funding referendum, well, not a referendum, but we had a funding package in 2015 that has generated about additional $1 billion for Georgia's transportation investment. And part of that legislation was putting it together a 10-year financial plan. We did financial planning anyway, but as you looked at a portfolio of projects that additional $1 billion can gain you, we had to start thinking strategically, how do you leverage those dollars strategically to do the things we needed to do, which from the legislation, one of the first things was state of good repair. Brandy mentioned that, strong bridges, good roadways and infrastructure, which is fundamental, the basis. But how did we do more in Georgia to move the needle on mobility? And in Georgia, we think about freight mobility and people mobility. It's all mobility, but we had to think about those. So as we, looked at how do we move forward with P3s, we basically baked that into a financial plan to see what projects we could do, which projects we couldn't do, and knew that public-private partnership in some form was part of that solution, because even with an additional $1 billion, it's sort of to the $200 billion or $500 billion, it's not enough. So that's what gave us the ability to start thinking, how do we integrate more in P3? We've had a little bit of experience. I'd say we're an emerging market in P3. We've done several public-private partnerships in a little different manner than most, but we knew that was a factor going forward. So our catalyst really was, hey, we have additional revenue. Now how do we deploy that and maximize it? Is one of the foundational thoughts, as well as looking for capacity to do the work and also look for innovation and technology. So there's a lot of factors that when Georgia started thinking about how do we move forward and is P3 as part of that portfolio of projects, those were the considerations we gave Simon.
So what I'm hearing is again, a common theme, leveraging public funds, whether it comes from the state, federal, or local sector.
Absolutely, all sources of funds, whether it be grants, loans, etc.
And then also innovation, which is a key topic for public-private partnerships. Okay, I'll kick it over to you, Bob.
Well, I guess I would say we all know the world has changed. The old days of going to Washington or going to your state capital and finding money for infrastructure, bringing it back, and then mixing it with local funds. I think those days are pretty much gone. We just heard that the federal government is going to be looking for new revenue sources. In Illinois, we have great needs. Our interstate system, we probably have $50 billion worth of need to bring that up to appropriate repair. And then you go downstate and we have probably 1,000 bridges that need substantial investment. So we're looking for different ways of doing things, and I think we're all going to be looking for different ways of doing things. And certainly P3s is one of those options. We're going to have to think out of the box. We're going to have to do things differently than what they've been done. And I think bringing the private sector in with their funds, working with the public sector is certainly a very viable alternative. It's not right for every type of project, but there are certainly projects out there that P3 would be the appropriate way to go. And we're, like everyone else in Illinois, looking for different ways of doing things.
And then Beverley, as former Transportation Secretary of Maryland, you probably have, out of the panelists here, perhaps one of the most experienced in P3s. So maybe as Secretary, what drove you to use P3s, particularly with respect to the port and the service plazas on I-95?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here, and I'm recovering from the flu, so my answers are going to be kind of short. I'm trying to hang on to my voice, so I apologize, but thank you. So yes, as the Secretary in Maryland, and Maryland was unique, a fairly prosperous state, good trust fund, but we had many, many needs and we had no funding for, so as was previously mentioned, with regard to the Port of Baltimore, which I was a unique deal of its time, and I think it's frankly still a unique deal, even 6 years later. It was a matter of wanting to invest in the Port of Baltimore, but not having, I would say, making those resources were not the priority. There were so many other things that we needed to do. So it was a matter of looking at the capital program and determining what things were appropriate and perhaps could benefit from bringing in a public-private partnership. And it was very unusual for Maryland because Maryland didn't play in the foray as much as many other states, hadn't done any of the traditional road projects that other states had. So it was very unique. We had to spend a lot of time selling it. The state legislature was very, very involved. But I think in the end, it was an excellent deal. It was the P3 deal of the year, received many, many awards, is still working out very, very well. And what it allowed the state of Maryland to do was to take an old container port that needed to be upgraded in order, frankly, for the Port of Baltimore to remain competitive. Without that port, we wouldn't be a container facility, wouldn't be able to continue to compete with Norfolk and the other ports on the East Coast. And also a very large factor in the timing, of course, was the Panama Canal. Wanted to make sure that the Port of Baltimore was prepared to handle the larger container ships that were coming through going to be coming through at that time, the Panama Canal. It achieved all of those goals and continues to achieve those goals. A very different public-private partnership in Maryland about the same time was much more traditional, and that was with regard to the new toll plazas that many of you, if you've traveled up and down the I-95 corridor by car, have probably used the toll plazas either in Delaware or Maryland. And in that case, it was an infrastructure that needed to be upgraded, but was not driven by money, was driven, frankly, by wanting to be able to compete with the other toll plazas that were built in the area, wanted to be financially successful, but wanted to bring in the innovation and the experience of a private sector. So in fact, a European firm was chosen to bring in the expertise to hopefully turn an old 1950s toll plaza into a thriving revenue source. So very different agendas that were driving that process.
So I guess as we heard, although P3s can be an effective tool and bring many benefits to the table, like being able to leverage public funds, innovation, expedited project delivery, P3s are complex transactions and, bring a host of policy, legal, technical, and financial issues. And so based on your experience, what challenges have you faced or anticipate to face, for those pursuing P3s for the first time in using P3s as a project delivery method? Russ.
All right, thank you. Well, there's certainly a host of challenges that you face, and I would say every project is unique. I think, they all have their unique characteristics, but those things you articulated, especially legal, the contracting document, those are very important to understand what those terms are and what you have in there. But there's other challenges too. I think organizationally we face is, as we've emerged into doing public-private partnerships, is that organizational strain that you have. Obviously, you need more resources, which are consultant resources in our case, as we have structured our initiatives with a program manager, consultant, and then GECs to deliver each of the projects. So that's good news for everybody here. We have more of that coming. But organizationally, we have to adapt and be ready to be open for innovation and for the whole process of a public-private partnership. Of those things, the good things we just talked about sometimes become a strain internally where we've got our way, we've always done things, and that's good. So, we have to be open for that. And it's been a great experience with the Georgia Department of Transportation to adopt and actually incorporate, things that we saw through technology and through advancements in design and good outcomes in construction technique to try to deploy those back for what we do. So there's a lot of those challenges. The resource challenge we have as we look forward in our portfolio of work, we have about $11 billion over about 8 years to be under contract for. That's a resource strain as well, whether it's A&E or whether it's right-of-way. In the construction sector as well. That's a pretty big load for us comparatively to where we've been, where we're usually about $1.5 billion construction dollars a year, something like that. So there's a lot of those challenges and nuances that are faced on all levels. But I like that question because I think a little bit more organizationally about the challenges we have to work through and be open. And I think that's what this community wants too, is to be able to, as said earlier today, challenge you guys and ladies to have good, solid, performance-based driven designs with outcomes, safety outcomes first and foremost. But we've got to be able to be willing to have some flexibility in that too, as the the finer elements of design come through a P3.
Yeah, actually, I think you've been reading my mind because I did want to follow up on prescriptive versus performance-based specifications. From an organizational standpoint and dealing with DOTs, it's very hard to convert from design, bid, build, then design, build, finance, operate, maintain, which is basically, it's P3s on steroids, right? And so how have you as an organization adjusted that mindset? What things do you feel is appropriately prescriptive? And what do you feel should be more performance-based? And what's the underlying rationale of having performance-based specifications in the P3 transaction?
So back to me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so, it's balance, and I'll tell you that's sort of where we are as a state. We're trying to emerge there to be a little more performance-based driven, I think, or outcome-driven. I think that balance is important, though, for both sides, both parties going into the deal. Obviously, prescriptive is a little more comforting to everybody at the table, but performance gives you the opportunity to really innovate and really to solve the problem that exists. It creates, though, that uncertainty initially from both parties if those performance outcomes and KPIs are not extremely explicit in what those goals should be and what those outcomes should be. As you mentioned, the design, build, finance is sort of where we are, and we're adding the operate, maintain. Been a little evolutionary because we have just outsourced more and more of our operations and maintenance in traditional roadway projects, and obviously express lanes with a toll component, which has the heavy operations, back office operations as well. Or the more we do, again, the more strain on human capital resources with agencies which are not expanding. Work's expanding, but we're not expanding, which relies us to then look to outsource more and more the O&M side. So we've seen this as a little bit of an evolutionary step. Now, we haven't deployed the full DBFOM. We're working that way. Our next project is it's about 20 miles of express lanes on a freeway in Georgia, and it would be a DBFOM. But again, we're contracting for most of that maintenance already, and so it's just a national evolution. But working through those performance-based versus prescriptive details, our approach in Georgia is just a little bit of a hybrid. I think it has to be a little bit of a hybrid. And that way, especially on the O&M side, there's understood and the way to price that versus the just the pure performance-based, which makes it a little hard to price. And of course, the uncertainty drives risk, which drives price, and that's always got to be a consideration.
Okay. And so, Bob, the Illinois Tollway Authority has yet to use P3s to deliver a project. To the extent you are considering using P3s, what challenges do you envision organizationally, from a policy standpoint?
Well, the tollway, in some ways, because we're a tollway, we're almost like a P3, or we're almost an anti-P3, because what we can do is we can build a project the same way that a P3 would, but we have no profit motive, so we can inherently do it for less money. Now, that doesn't mean that we haven't used P3s in certain areas. We can't. We use them with our OASIS, and we've been successful there in doing that. We have some contractual relationships with some of the telecom companies so that they can use some of our standards. So we're looking for different ways to do P3s, but usually on a smaller scale than what I think you're talking about doing in Georgia. And generally speaking, getting back to the first question of what are some of the challenges, in Illinois, we've done a couple of P3s. Chicago has done some P3s, and they haven't really been perceived to be as positive as they could be. Our parking meters, we sold our parking meters, and then the city took the proceeds and spent them all fairly quickly. I don't think that the public appreciated that. So I guess I would say, certainly, like with anything that you're doing differently, you want to have success with your first project. So you really need to pick that project carefully. You have to make sure that the public understands it, that they understand what the benefit is going to be, because if you're going to do that second project, you're going to do it on the back of the first one. And that's one of the things we're struggling with in Illinois. Basically, we've done some parking garages in Chicago. We did the parking meters, and I think the public just really thought that what the government is doing is they're selling their assets, that it's taken many years to build up and that belong to the people, and that they're using them for short-term fixes. And that creates some real problems, and our legislature has been reticent to approve other P3 projects. So I think you really have to think about the public relations. You have to pick the right project, and you have to recognize that that first one, you need to be successful, and people need to understand what you're doing and how it benefits them.
Now, Beverley, picking up on what Bob said, I agree that stakeholder outreach, public communication is essential with respect to making sure a public-private partnership is successful. And that's one of the challenges. You know, public agencies aren't necessarily well-equipped to deal with that communication. You know, as former Secretary of Maryland, how did you deal with stakeholder outreach, you know, during the port, during the travel plazas?
Well, again, because those were unique projects, they weren't highway projects, so very different. And it is, as has been mentioned, it's very important, first of all, to make sure you have leadership. If it's at the state, obviously a governor who's pushing forward and driving an agenda and believes in that. And then also getting buy-in, certainly in a state like Maryland, from your legislative leadership for doing your first public-private partnerships. And then you've got to look at who are your stakeholders with each project. So in the case of the Port of Baltimore, it really wasn't so much the public. The public really wasn't, you know, even aware of it. In that case, it was more not only your state politicians, but the city of Baltimore. and the region around Baltimore in terms of making sure you're selling the economic development prospects and helping people understand that if you don't have the elected officials, if you don't have a thriving port, how it's going to affect the city as well as the region. And then you had particular constituencies. So in that case, for example, Union, ILA, a very, very big issue with the Port of Baltimore. So obviously a lot of selling, a lot of talking, a lot of communicating to them in terms of what the impacts would be or would not be upon that as a result of the transfer of the ownership of the port from the public sector to the private sector. It wasn't without its challenges, but credit to the leadership there at the union as well. We were able to work through those things, but that took time. So it varies with each kind of project that you have. Obviously then with a project which in Maryland with our toll plazas and the toll, Maryland has had toll authority for many decades. So that really was not, again, it wasn't a particular selling issue. The issues there were more closely related to how the revenue was being used, because at the same time we were looking at toll increases and other things like that. So a matter again of selling the value of the project in that case, but knowing who your stakeholders are, and then having the leadership and the marketing campaign, so to speak, to go at them one-on-one. And and maybe you may need 3 or 4 different messages if you have 3 or 4 different stakeholders. So certainly we didn't have the same message for the to the ILA. As we did for the politicians and the officials, the mayor of Baltimore, for example.
Right. As we've heard, public-private partnerships can be used to deliver a wide array of infrastructure assets. You have roads, you have tollways, you have travel plazas, ports, but also vertical infrastructure, right? Like courthouses, universities, and I think we all recognize, however, that not one size fits all, and so I think depending on the type of infrastructure asset you're trying to deliver will definitely influence how you put together a P3 transaction. And so I want to ask a 2-part question to the panel. First of all, what are some of the unique issues as you try to implement P3s for different types of asset classes? And I guess relatedly, are there certain project types or assets that are more suited for P3s than other types? I'll go to Russ.
Okay, well, I'll start with the second part first. Is obviously anything that had a revenue generation component is much better suited. I mean, that's sort of the obvious. In Georgia, we're doing that a little different. Again, we have a state road and tollway authority that we contract with to deliver these projects. And we're really doing the design, build, finance, operate, maintain, or design, build, finance, sometimes with a little f, as we call it, because the finance component may be very short term, maybe 3 to 5 years post-construction payback. And again, that's sort of in our financial plan to figure out what's the right way to advance projects that move the needle on mobility. Some of these projects have 20–30% delay reduction when built. One of them goes up almost a 60% reduction in delay for adding some GP lanes on the interstate. And you look at that sort of road user cost return on investment versus your finance cost. The other component of that was very important to us, because you can apply this to many different types of projects. Several of these are just interchanges, no toll generation, no revenue generation, but the return on investment is what's important. And you just look again at that finance charge that we put over on the private side to either use TIFIA, PABs, whatever. Some of these are small enough that they can carry their cost on their balance sheet maybe, or a portion of it. So we look at that cost of finance. That's real. I mean, we have to understand what that cost of finance is. But as it goes now, that doesn't get reflected necessarily on the state's rating. We meet with all our rating agencies, obviously, and go through our portfolio of projects to make sure that our AAA bond rating is not in jeopardy. These are contractual costs, or you look at it from that point of view. It has to be shown in the CAFR. Of course, rating agencies are a little bit, I think they're leaning more now toward, well, that may be debt of the state if you've got a contractual liability. That if it's long term, we're trying to keep ours very short in that 3 to 5 year range on most projects that are DBF. So it's a good tool, but back to the first part is, I think there's an opportunity for many different type projects. Obviously, vertical construction has a long history with P3s and across the world. But we're using one now that's really a technology P3 of deploying broadband throughout all the interstates of Georgia. We're just getting underway, and it's really an asset recycling approach of using the existing fiber optic network we have in Metro Atlanta in leveraging some 300 miles of fiber optic network in return to build out the fiber optic network throughout all interstates in Georgia for really about three purposes. The first and foremost is to expand our traffic, what we call our navigator system, or ATMS, ITS applications of camera signs, data, so that we can manage traffic much more effectively in all the interstates of Georgia. Secondly, be ready for this 21st century technology, because whatever the CAV solution is, everything goes back to fiber. All the data, big data, all goes back to a fiber backbone somewhere that goes to the cloud, and before it's disseminated and going back to vehicles. You know, we know that we need to have a strong cellular network through Georgia for that purpose. And thirdly, sort of what, again, at the national level was the same, the conversation at the national level of bringing broadband to rural America. We're able to do this potentially for rural Georgia by having the backbone throughout our interstates that then locally you can make those connections, or the sewer, water sewer trunk line, and then you can radiate out from there. So again, a different approach. It doesn't have to be a it doesn't have to be a greenfield toll road, but again, trying to leverage the private sector technology, capital as well, to do things that are innovative and different. So I think to answer both questions, I mean, it's really, you have to consider all things and see if it's the right fit, but not all projects make good P3 projects, that's for sure.
Right. So Bob, I know that, as director, you're focused more on one type of asset class, which are toll roads, but obviously, you know the industry. Any thoughts in terms of how delivering a different asset with respect to P3s influences the structure or the considerations?
Well, I would agree with Russ, that probably the first thing is that we all have to remember is that P3s, you usually have a private company coming in some form or fashion, and they're there to make money. So revenue is important. It's probably paramount. They're not doing these things for free, and we don't expect them to do that. And if the partnership is going to be good, they're going to have to be able to make a profit. And the problem is, if they don't make a profit, if they get beat down too much in the negotiations, it's probably going to end up with the government anyhow, because the government or the agency that's employing them, they're the fundamental guarantor on that. And then everyone loses. If it comes back to the government and they have to pick up the pieces and the private sector leaves, it's a problem. So I think you have to work very carefully to make sure, well, number one, you have to understand there is a profit motive, and then you have to work carefully with the private entity to make sure that they're going to be successful. And it comes back to what we talked about before. This is a project by project determination. There's clearly a revenue source that can work well. Others, it's a little bit hazier and probably a little bit riskier because of that. And then I also think from the government point of view, when you start looking at what the cost is going to be to the public, how is the public going to feel about this? If the cost gets to be too high, if your toll is too high, then you're going to get pushback towards the public officials. So I think you really have to look at these things on a project by project basis. We've seen where you have student housing on universities and colleges. That has historically worked pretty well. It has to be obviously affordable, but the public sector can bring in their particular expertise in that particular area, and it can really be a very good partnership. And we've seen some where you toll bridges, where otherwise the bridge wouldn't be able to be built. We're working with some local governments on that right now, some counties that need to build some bridges, and we're doing some of the backroom work for them. So I think that there is certainly a place for the private sector to come in, but once again, I think you have to you have to make sure that things are going to work for them and that there has to be an ongoing revenue source.
And so, Beverley, I'd be interested in hearing, you compare and contrast your experience with respect to dealing with the port, the travel plaza, and actually I want to maybe bring in the Union Station redevelopment. So your thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously you always have to look first at the profit. And I mentioned previously when Maryland, we were looking at raising tolls, and we would go to many hearings on raising the tolls, and people would say, well, you should privatize it, then you wouldn't have a toll. And, or do a P3 and you wouldn't have a toll, it wouldn't cost us anything, which I always thought was interesting. But so hopefully the public is starting to understand that there is no free ride. I think transit is obviously a particular interest of mine and an area that I think we haven't really been able to figure out how to do a great job with in terms of P3s. I think certainly the country started to accept, and we can build roadways and schools, and as in Maryland, golf courses and college dorms and many, many other things. And so I'm anxiously looking back to Maryland with Pete Ron, of course, with the Purple Line, some attempts to try to figure out how to get that profit motive figured out within a transit project. And but I think sometimes we think about P3s, we still think about them sort of in a standardized way. And I think as we do more and more of them, come to understand that each and every one is so unique, and really any combination of bringing public and private funding together is a form of a P3. So in Washington Union Station case, back in the early 1980s, with leadership from, at the time, Secretary Elizabeth Dole and Congress at the time, very unique public-private partnership, where they took a federal asset. They wanted to remain a federal asset, but they wanted to figure out a way to make it successful and bring private infrastructure and into it and commercialization, but without it costing the federal government any money. So very creative. They created a nonprofit. So Union Station Redevelopment Corporation is actually a 501c3 organized within the District of Columbia. And then the building was leased from the federal government to the nonprofit, with the instruction for the nonprofit then to lease it to a commercial entity, which was successfully done back in 1985, rebuilt, and it's essentially what is essentially a 99-year lease. The original developer did sell the development in 2007. That went very smoothly. All of the legal agreements and things had been in place to foresee that kind of a transfer. So that was done. And now, of course, we're looking to figure out how to do what we call the second century of Union Station. In that case, however, the historic building will, of course, remain the historic asset and federally owned. But figuring out how to then, of course, work with Amtrak, I guess technically a private corporation. Then there is a developer that purchased the air rights sold by the federal government, Chip Ackridge, that wants to build a development, a transit-oriented development, over top of Amtrak, a TOD, while we will still have another private developer operating the commercial entities within the station. And then we have a number of both public and private entities that actually touch the property. So I think in that case, and originally when the plan came out in 2012, they were talking about it as a public-private partnership. It's not going to be a public-private partnership. I think in the end, it's going to be a multitude of numerous little p public-private partnerships with the various stakeholders in order to retain it as a multimodal transportation facility, as well as a major private development that's transforming, the northeastern section of Washington, D.C. So again, a very exciting sort of new version of how do you merge the public and the private sector to save a public asset, but then also provide a public and private good.
So I want to pivot a little bit and maybe focus on the role of financing and funding. In P3s, there's a lot of focus on how private financing influences the P3 transaction, but the owner or the sponsor of the project still has, I'd say, financial interest, monetary skin in the game. And so I want to ask, how do the owner's financial constraints or requirements sort of influence how and when you deliver an infrastructure project or asset? Maybe Russell, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, it certainly affects the how and the when. And again, it's just looking at the needs that you have and really sort of back to the planning process of identifying what you need to be doing to, you know, improve mobility, state of good repair, all those things. You have to bake that into your financial plan. And we've been at a place that wasn't good before, where we carried a huge debt load from previous bond programs. And, you know, when you're living with 30–40% debt payment, you can't get a lot done. So that has really shaped and influenced to how we're looking forward, looking at our revenue streams, state and federal. And let's say it again, you know, long-term federal funding is good. Sustainable long-term federal funding is good, right? You're in D.C., why don't you mention that while you're here over and over? Our governor likes to say, tell them 3 times, you know, on everything. So, you know, for the 3rd time, long-term sustainable federal funding is very good for states. Because when you look at these deals, they're especially for us and DBFOMs, you're getting in 35-year deals. Right. And, you know, when you got a funding bill that ends in 2020, you know, you're counting on sustainable long-term federal funding as a basis. But to your point, I mean, we have to look at all the mixes of dollars. We've been very successful in Georgia with community improvement districts as well, where groups of a geographic area of businesses decide to tax themselves for additional revenue to do things usually transportation related. We had one of our projects, which was a P3, where a community improvement district put in $10 million to a project. I mean, that's a substantial skin in the game. So you have to look at all those revenue streams, and those are the considerations you give of how do you advance a project that may be in a P3 form. Is, you know, what are all the sources of funds that you have, the timing of those, and again for us is, you know, what does the future look like too, because we don't want to go back to that place where, you know, we deliver some projects, but it comes at the detriment of a bigger program. And so we want to make sure that there's a sustainable path forward to do all the projects that, not only these 11 projects we've identified, they're sort of one-offs or part of a bigger program. We have to do the other projects that come behind that to continue to build the system.
And so I'll skip Bob for this one. How about Beverley? You know, in terms of the owner's funding and financial constraints, especially in the context of perhaps the professional engineering consulting group, how does that sort of impact your project planning, and what type of things should the industry be sensitive about?
Well, in our case, with it's more relevant, I think, for me with the Union Station redevelopment project, because the nature of the projects in Maryland, it wasn't really a part of the game there. But obvious with regard to something like Union Station. I mean, we have a massive redevelopment planned, probably 30 years it's going to take, a huge number of stakeholders. We are employing, between us and Amtrak and the developers, many of the firms that are in the room, I think, are taking part in some aspect of the Union Station redevelopment project. And it's just, I think we have many, many needs with a project like Union Station. So we are, I mean, we're looking for assistance from the community on everything, from titling, LIDAR surveys, planning, the NEPA process, design, from the rail, Amtrak terminal infrastructure, to the looking at the retail side, what's going to be the biggest asset in terms of the kinds of stores that we should have. How should those stores be designed? How would they fit in with the design? How do you integrate the train hall? All of this while also trying to make sure that we are respectful and maintain the historic integrity of the buildings that are attached and the area that are attached. So we certainly, I couldn't even tell you the number of contracts right now and firms in the ACEC community that we have at USRC, and we're a fairly small player in terms of the actual procurements. We're sort of the facilitator of a project like this. But from Amtrak and all of the others then, really that's who we look to, are the architects and the engineers. We can take the vision, and there was a great vision, but in terms of making it a reality, then much less getting in through the process and getting a design. Is where we have partnerships with this community.
Okay, and then Bob, just sticking with the theme of financing, obviously tolls is a revenue stream to build and operate your toll roads. So, you know, as director of the Tollway Authority, what role do you see tolls playing in P3s? And also, you know, where do you see the tolling authorities in the P3 conversation? You know, you had previously mentioned that in some ways, tolling authorities may be anti or be competitors to private developers. Maybe provide some thoughts and context on that issue.
Just by way of a little bit of background, the Toll Highway Authority in Illinois is an independent entity, and the only money that we get is from our customers. We don't get any federal money, we don't get any state money, and we don't get any local money. And we have a trust fund with or a trust agreement with our bondholders so that the state won't come in essentially and use our money for anything else. So we're a standalone entity, and we function well. This year we'll have revenue of about $1.4 billion, and our expenses, including our debt service, are going to be about $700 million. So we'll take the rest of those funds, we'll plow them back into our system to improve it, and we're about 60 years old, and we've come pretty close to rebuilding our system. In the next 5 to 10 years, we will be done doing that, and we've told the Illinois Department of Transportation, the state, that we can help with some of their roads. So we work fairly well, and the Illinois Department of Transportation, unfortunately, because the budget problems that we have in Illinois has sort of falling on difficult funding times. So they are looking at implementing some P3s, and one of the discussions that we have on a regular basis is, well, instead of bringing in a private entity to, you know, you would bring us in to toll your road, and the revenue from that we would take to either pay debt or to pay the private entity. And we said, well, maybe since we have a system, we could take some roads here and there and fix them. And we've had some conversations about that. Route 80 going through Illinois is not tolled at this point. It's a road that has substantial safety concerns, and that might be a good project for the Tollway to take over in the future, and that's a multi-billion-dollar project. We could put people to work and provide a better service. But coming back to what I said, and what you said, Simon, too, also about the Tollway and P3s, in a lot of ways, we being the Tollway, think that we can provide the service better than what a P3 does because we don't have a profit motive. Now, that's not to mean that there certainly aren't projects in Illinois where it would be appropriate for a P3 to come in. As I said before, there are local bridges, there are state bridges that would be away from our system that we couldn't serve, that we couldn't maintain. So it comes back to project by project. You have to look at all of these and see, would it be better for this to be part of the Tollway system? Would it be better for this to be a public-private partnership that the Tollway helped on or that IDOT helped on? And we recognize in Illinois that we're part of the transportation system, and as we all know, the world is changing dramatically, and it's imperative that we all work together. The Illinois Department of Transportation work with the Tollway, that the Tollway and the Illinois Department of Transportation work with the private entities, and that's sort of where it comes back to, it's project by project determination.
So let's see, looking at the time, you know, given the audience, I want to make sure that I ask at least one question addressing the role of design and engineering consultants in the context of P3s. And hopefully this is a softball question. You know, I guess, how do owners use design and consulting engineers in the planning and implementing of P3 projects? I guess, cut to the chase, will P3s put these folks out of business, or will they create more business opportunities? Russell.
Well, for us, it's a tremendous opportunity. What we're delivering now actually started from a consultant planning study that we were looking at managed lanes throughout metropolitan Atlanta to build a system of express lanes or managed lanes. And this thing's been around for decades, and we've moved from HOV to HOT to ETL, but really looking at a system which now, again, we had the framework from a planning point of view that has translated into now program management to GEC to CEI to right-of-way services, all the full gamut to deliver the projects, which ultimately turn into a developer of which you'll be participating in, on the teaming and moving forward. But to us, we don't have enough resources to do our base work, much less these bigger type projects. So we certainly count on the ACEC community to be a part of that to deliver. And the flip side of that coin is once you get under a contract, though it's a little bit of a unique relationship that we struggle with, and I think most of you struggle with, is you've got a developer team that you're on, and we're usually a little more collaborative, sitting down solving problems, and we have to understand the makeup of that contract. But I can tell you at Georgia, I think we've had a good experience because we have partnering, whether formal or informal, and we really encourage the developer to say, let's communicate regular and often and get early small wins, and work, because every project's unique and every team's unique, and there's personalities, right, that you have to work with. But we want to get those things, the ugly stuff, on the table early and work through it, because it doesn't get any better, right? So however that plays out, we believe strongly in the communication, but there's that fine line too of risk and risk transfer that we all have to understand. And that's a struggle again for us internally, because we work with you guys. We see this, we see you and work with you on our normal projects, on our DBB projects. So yep. It's a little bit of a new world, so to speak, but we understand. I think everybody understands that. But again, as I said from the onset, this is a we proposition. We're all in this to be successful, and that's what we need to do.
Okay, I guess Beverley and Bob, anything else to add to Russell's comments?
Well, the only thing I would say is that it's an exciting time to be in transportation. There's a lot of changes taking place. There's a lot of opportunities, technology, the opportunities we're going to have from technology in the future in transportation are just going. We don't even know what they're going to be. So I think it's a tremendous time for engineers and for planners. It comes back to we need to work together. We need to communicate. I tell our people we're building roads for the 21st century. Your job is to read the future and make sure that we do them in the best way possible. And as government people, we don't always read the future as well as possible. So we need people to help us do that. So I think it's an exciting time for all of us, and the only thing I can say is we look forward to working with you on many projects in the future as we build the infrastructure for the 21st century.
Well, since Washington Union Station redevelopment is one of the most complex projects in probably not just the country, probably the world, to figure out how to build it over the next 10 years, we already have and will be continuing to look to the ACEC community to help us figure out how we're going to build a massive, really a city over top of a railroad track, over top of the second busiest Amtrak railroad station, while continuing to operate the railroad 24/7. So we're going to need lots of help.
Well, thank you. Now, we do have some time, I think, for questions.
How and where do you see QBS fitting into the P3 structure, the future of it? How will it maybe evolve as things go forward?
Russell?
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, when you're doing these projects, best value is our approach. Trying to make the best value selection, and those components of QBS that relate to that. I mean, that's really the essence. You're trying to get the very best project you can, the best project team you can, for the outcome that you're trying to achieve. So I think it's hand in glove is the way I look at it and the way we approach it.
Any other questions? Dave, you want to poke the group for more questions?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the panel speaker. I'm based in London, and I'm really pleased that you talked about America is very much in the early stage of 3 Ps. As you probably know, we've gone through what we call 3 Ps. We are now in PFI 1, PFI 2, and the story goes on. The question I have for the audience is, you predominantly focus on transportation, which is quite important. And you can see the transaction, understanding of the revenue stream. I wonder whether there's any lesson learned from the experiences from Europe, particularly now that we have more contractors in difficulties in sustaining long-term projects, on first point. And the second point is, what is the panel's opinion on what I call the secondary market? You've built the asset, and then the operator decided to unbundle and leave. And what is the panel's view on that particular issue? Thank you.
I'll jump in. One, I'll say we have a great relationship in Georgia with our British Consul General, and actually had our chief engineer and our treasurer go over and meet with some of our counterparts in London. Was for a seminar, I think it was about 4 or 5 days, which they brought back tremendous knowledge and lessons learned from the UK, which was very important to us. A couple of notions that we have in Georgia, and again, every state's different and every situation is a little different, but we haven't done a pure toll concession model. It's still, again, we have a tollway agency in Georgia that we want to take that revenue risk, because we want to be the ones that set the toll from the political part of that, as we've talked about, the sensitivity of that. We want what we're doing are express lanes. So we want to move the most traffic possible at the safest speed at the lowest cost, which is different from a profit model, when you look at your toll and revenue. So we've sort of taken some of that risk that we've seen where concessionaires have had trouble and forecasts may have not been what they had anticipated and revenues are not what they anticipated. So we look at that. The O&M part of that, I think we all have to go in eyes wide open, that has to be portable. And that was mentioned earlier, is that that the O&M part's probably going to be sold at some point. So I think that contract piece, that's why you need good attorneys, good counsel, to make sure that you work through those knowing that what that outcome may be, and that you don't end up where something gets sort of sold off in bits and pieces and you've got a lot of individual pieces that don't add up to the sum of the parts anymore. So those are kind of things that we've seen as lessons learned that we're trying to bake in and try to deploy as we go forward. I'm going to tell you that I don't know that we have that perfect answer, and I think each project, again, is so unique, and that's why you spend a tremendous amount of time in understanding that contract and getting that contract document the way you need it.
Any other questions?
Hello? Yes, I have a question back here. I have a connection to all three of you. My career started in Chicago. We've got an office in Atlanta. I took the train up from Richmond to Union Station last night, so I've got a connection with all three. Our firm found it a struggle in the P3. When you talk about best value and then you talk about QBS, there can be a very high cost to compete before you're ever selected for a project. And that cost might be difficult to recover in the next cost as you're looking at what the fee may be and the iterations you go through. At what point in time are you seeing there being the right point to select the team? How much work is required up front to do that at risk as we try to develop business models to sort of make the risk worth the effort?
Maybe I can add a comment, because I do see that as an issue that the industry has been voicing, that chasing a P3 pursuit is very expensive. And obviously, whatever stipend that the owner is able to provide isn't going to cover the cost, right? And so I know owners are very conscious about that fact and want to develop, I guess, a reliable and consistent, at least a procurement process to sort of minimize those transaction costs. You know, obviously the amount of innovation that the owner wants from a public-private partnership is going to influence how much, I guess, engineering sweat and equity you guys put in. But I know that it is an issue that the industry has been at least talking to at least my clients about. And it is something that I think the public agencies and owners need to be a better job to sort of lower down those pursuit costs. Because at the end of the day, we do want competition. Because competition obviously influences price and leads to, I think, the best selection of a team. But maybe Beverly, if you can add.
I mean, that's definitely a concern that we are aware of, and we're talking about it. One of the reasons that USRC is, although we're a very small agency, 10 employees, and we're sort of very powerful board, though. USDOT Secretary is my board chair. So puts us in a very unique position. Because we're a nonprofit, though, we're sort of leading the procurements at this point for both the, with our partners Amtrak and the private developer. And one of the reasons that we're doing that is because an entity like Amtrak needs the transparency and the competition. But the private developer, in the procurements we've done, they don't want it to take as long as normally a public entity would take. So we were sort of the group in the middle. Because we're the nonprofit, we're sort of able, we still try to do things, or we still do things very transparently because of who chairs the board, but we're certainly able to be much more nimble and innovative than a public entity or even an Amtrak. So, and we're getting ready to do some construction work where we're looking at the same issue. So at USRC, I would be very interested in hearing from any of you with regard to ideas and way to make sure that we're getting good bids and we're getting lots of competition, but also understanding that it costs you all a lot of money sometimes to bid. And that's a very, very big concern of ours. So thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, I think we are about out of time. Oh, one more? Do we have?
Yes, I have a question for each of you. And Bob, you talked about bringing technology. Russell, you talked about best value. When it comes to actually contracting with members of ACEC in the private, historically we've always been compensated on an hourly basis. And bringing this technology, being able to get jobs done faster, can you share with us what you're currently doing from changing that model from a hourly based to a value based and lump sum contracting?
Well, I'll respond initially. We're still doing it hourly, but I will tell you that I tell our people all the time, look for different ways of doing things, think out of the box, and all things are on the table. It comes back to what I said, as we move forward with scarce funds and with new opportunities, I think it is imperative that you think out of the box and look at different ways of doing things. So we're hopeful that if you have good ideas and good methods of contracting, certainly we'll consider them. Like anything else, we may have to agree to disagree, but we at least want to have an open mind to look at doing things differently, because as I said earlier on, the old ways of doing things, we're not going to be able to do them like that anymore.
Yeah, and I'll just add in, I mean, in a design build finance or a P3, it's really sort of designed to budget approach, right? I mean, ultimately there's a lump sum, and I know that's a strain, and that's a tension that all you have to endure. I would say Georgia's had a pretty good experience on a sales tax program, though, where, again, there was a sales tax with a project list, sort of like your local municipalities may have, but each project had a standalone budget, and it's really, again, we've deployed through QBS to make selections, but the designer knows that there's a limited budget on each project, and I think that's been a good sort of process to sort of think about, again, outcome-based approach, because you're just trying to deliver that scope that was identified originally, sometimes with very constrained budgets. The political process it went through maybe not was needed a lot of help from the ACEC community, because some of them were just political estimates on napkins, and then you have to design and deliver that. But I think, again, as we think about performance-based design and outcomes, it makes it hard. And I think, again, that's that sort of that tension, especially in P3, is from prescriptive performance. Probably the more costing plans, at least a notion that an agency has, the better, because you can start responding to that. Or if it's totally performance-based, then, you know, it's the sky's the limit, and are you thinking the same thing as your competitor's thinking, and you don't know. And so it's just that natural tension that we, as we go forward, same as for Bob, is any of those kind of things that you can think of or bring to us, I think we can learn from and try to deploy in procurements going forward. But it's a challenge, no doubt.
Okay, with that, please join me in thanking the panelists.